There were Lily at ballroom, and my son was at the microphone, and he pointed at me. Not because he was proud of me, because I was the punchline. I want you to hold that image for a second. A man, 71 years old, navy blazer, shoes he polished that morning, seated at the table farthest from the stage, the table you get assigned when someone loves you just enough to put you on the guest list. His son is up there, tall and lit and commanding the room the way a man does when he's finally arrived somewhere he always believed he deserved to be. And the son is pointing, and the room is laughing, and the man at the far table is smiling. Because after 71 years, you understand that sometimes a smile is the only weapon left with any dignity attached to it. I am that man. My name is Raymond Ellison. I am 71 years old, retired, south side of Chicago, and I want to tell you something that happened to me on a Saturday night in the Gold Coast, and then again 6 weeks later on the 38th floor of a building on Michigan Avenue. I need you to stay with me through all of it, especially the parts that are slow, because the way this ends is not the ending you are building in your head right now. I promise you that. Subscribe if you haven't, and when you finish, leave me a comment. I read everyone. Let me set the scene, because the scene matters. My son, Marcus Ellison, had organized a fundraising dinner at the Ashford House, which is one of those event spaces in the Gold Coast where the floral arrangements cost more than my first car, and the staff greet you with the specific warmth of people who have decided, before you arrived, that you are probably not as important as the other guests. $650 a plate. 180 people in black tie. The kind of room where everybody is performing their own success for everybody else and calling it philanthropy. Marcus had called me 3 weeks before, and I could hear in his voice the particular brand of excitement he reserves for things that will benefit him directly, that slightly too fast, slightly too warm energy he's had since he was 19 and needed to borrow my car. He said I had to be there. He said it was going to be incredible. He said he needed his family present. I should have noticed then that Marcus Ellison did not need family. Marcus needed an audience. But he was my son. So I pressed my blazer. I shined my shoes. I took the blue line from the south side because I have never once paid Gold Coast parking rates on principle, and I have no intention of starting now. I walked into the Ashford House at 7 o'clock on a Saturday evening, feeling, if not exactly proud, at least present. At least there. Honestly, I want to pause here and say something. If you have ever dressed carefully for an event where you suspected just quietly, in the back of your chest, that you were going to be out of place, you know what that walk from the elevator to the ballroom feels like. You know how you straighten your jacket one extra time. You know how you look for a friendly face in the first 30 seconds so you have somewhere to land. I knew that walk. I've known it my whole life. And I'll tell you something about that feeling. It never entirely goes away, no matter how old you get. You just get better at not letting it show. My seat was at table 16. I will tell you without bitterness that table 16 was positioned near the kitchen, which meant I had an excellent view of waitstaff, and a partial view of the stage, and a complete view of the table assignments being made by someone who had thought about it just long enough to be deliberate. I introduced myself to the couple beside me, a retired teacher from Evanston and her husband, a civil engineer who'd spent 30 years with the city. Regular people. My kind of people. We talked about the lakefront and the construction on the Dan Ryan and the particular grief of the Bears, as Chicagoans do. Marcus found me during cocktail hour. He shook my hand. He shook my hand. The way you shake the hand of someone you recognize from a professional event but cannot immediately place. He said I looked great. He said he was glad I could make it. Then someone more important appeared over his shoulder, and Marcus was gone before he finished the sentence. I raised this man. I packed his lunch for 11 years. I drove him to baseball practice in the rain without being asked. I co-signed the lease on his first apartment on the north side when he was 24 and had 3 months of savings and enormous confidence. I sat in the emergency room at Rush Medical at 2 in the morning when he was 9 years old and running a fever that frightened me more than anything I have experienced before or since. And he shook my hand like I was a vendor he vaguely recognized. I had a glass of wine, then another. I ate the bread because at 71 years old, I have absolutely earned the bread, and I will not apologize for it. I listened to 2 speakers discuss job training programs on the west side, which was genuinely moving work and made me briefly forget I was sitting at table 16 like a footnote in someone else's story. Then Marcus took the stage. And I'll say this, because I believe in honesty even when it complicates things. He was extraordinary up there, tall, clean in his tuxedo, that particular ease that fills a room without demanding it. He told a joke. It landed. He spoke about the foundation's work with real passion, and something loosened in my chest. Maybe I had been wrong to feel what I felt all evening. Maybe this was the Marcus I raised. Maybe. He said they were going to do something a little different. The room leaned forward. He asked how many people had a dad. Laughter, hands raised. He asked how many had a boring dad. More laughter, more hands. And then he said he had brought his tonight. He pointed directly at me. 180 heads turned toward table 16 like a single animal waking up. Stand up, Dad. What do? When your son is holding a microphone and a room full of strangers is looking at you and the only two options are dignity or a scene, you choose dignity every time. I stood up. Ladies and gentlemen, Marcus said with the timing of a man who had been rehearsing this, I want you to meet Raymond Ellison, retired, south side of Chicago, loves Civil War documentaries, goes to bed at 9 o'clock, and once told me he paused for the quote. He actually paused that a good Saturday was finding a useful thing at the hardware store. The room came apart. Real laughter, warm laughter, the kind that doesn't believe it's causing harm because it can't imagine what harm would look like from the inside. I stood there and smiled. 71 years had taught me that smiling is sometimes the only dignified option available. I smiled the way you smile when something is taking more from you than you intend to show. And then Marcus said they were going to auction off an evening with his boring dad. Dinner for two, on the foundation. Starting bid, $1. Because honestly, he let the pause do the work that might be generous. The room lost itself. Someone at table 2 shouted $1 and the crowd cheered like he'd said something brilliant. Marcus pointed at them like a game show host who has never been happier. Do I hear 2? I was still standing, still smiling. And somewhere very old and very quiet inside me, something was making a decision. Then it happened. From the far end of the room, near the windows, a voice came through the laughter, the way a fire alarm comes through music. Not louder than everything else, just different in a way that made everything else stop. $100,000. The room didn't quiet gradually, it stopped. 180 people mid-breath, mid-sentence, mid-sip. The bartender near the side wall stopped pouring. The string quartet that had been warming up in the corner stopped. Something in the actual temperature of that room changed. Marcus's grin stayed on his face for about 4 seconds after his brain registered what his ears had heard. His mouth held the shape of the smile while the rest of his expression tried to catch up. He said into the microphone, his voice doing something I had never heard it do, something that sounded like a crack at a seam. Did someone say $100,000? The voice said it again. Same volume, same tone. The voice of a man who was not accustomed to repeating himself and was doing so only as a courtesy. The man was already standing. Mid-60s or early 70s, silver at the temples, dark suit, no tie. The kind of stillness that a room full of achievers recognized immediately. The stillness of a man who had stopped needing to prove anything to anyone and had freed up an enormous amount of energy in doing so. I didn't know who he was. Raymond Ellison, 71 years old, standing at table 16 in a navy blazer, had absolutely no idea who this man was or why he had just offered $100,000 to have dinner with him. But he looked at me across that room and I looked at him, and something passed between us. I still can't entirely name it. A recognition, I think. The specific recognition between two men who have spent long portions of their lives being miscalculated and have, over time, developed a very particular patience about it. Marcus recovered. Barely. He announced the bid in a voice that had entirely lost its game show quality. The room applauded differently this time. Not warm laughter. Something closer to awe and confusion and the collective social anxiety of a crowd that has just realized the joke went somewhere unexpected. I sat down. The retired teacher from Evanston was looking at me with an expression I can only describe as rapid reassessment. The civil engineer was looking at me like he wished he had introduced himself more carefully. I picked up my wine. I took a slow sip, and I thought, 71 years. Not once, but now I was curious. I was genuinely, deeply curious. His name was Gerald Whitmore. His assistant called the following morning composed, efficient, the voice of someone who is the most competent person in any room she enters and has stopped needing recognition for it. We arranged breakfast for the following Thursday at a restaurant on the Magnificent Mile with no sign visible from the street and a menu with no prices listed. I wore the navy blazer again. It was becoming a lucky blazer. My ex-wife Diane would have hated that sentiment. She was not a superstitious woman. I always was. Gerald was already seated when I arrived. He stood when I approached. Firm handshake, direct eye contact, brief. Coffee appeared before either of us asked for it. I decided immediately that I liked this place. He said he would be direct because he didn't enjoy wasting time his or anyone else's. I told him neither did I. He studied me for a moment with the focused attention of a man accustomed to making fast, accurate evaluations. Then he said a name. Calvin Marsh. I put my coffee down. I had not heard that name spoken aloud in 9 years. Calvin Marsh was my oldest friend, my college roommate at Morehouse in 1975, when we were both broke and certain, and absolutely convinced that the world owed us something significant. It didn't, but we were young and entitled to the belief. I want you to picture Calvin Marsh the way I knew him then, 6 feet tall, always slightly too large jacket, the most persuasive human being I have ever met in my life. Not because he was slick, but because he was honest in a way that disarmed people before they'd decided to be defensive. He believed things the way a river believes the direction it's going. 28 years ago, Calvin had come to see me at my kitchen table on the south side with a yellow legal pad covered in numbers and the look of a man who had exhausted every other option, but had not yet exhausted his faith in the idea. He needed $40,000 in 6 months. He'd been everywhere. Banks, investors, family, nobody would move. He knew his supply chain concept worked the way he knew his own face in the mirror. I looked at the legal pad. I looked at Calvin. I thought about the fact that in 30 years of friendship, this man had not lied to me once. Not once. Not about anything that mattered. I gave him the money. Quietly. No contract, no equity stake, no attorney involvement. A handshake and a wire transfer from an account my wife didn't know existed, because Diane would have told me I had taken leave of my senses and she would not have been entirely wrong, and I already knew what I was going to do and didn't want the conversation. 8 months later, Calvin's logistics company had its first major contract. 2 years after that, a second, then a third. When Calvin sold the company 17 years ago, a transaction that generated a number I still find strange to hold in my head, he had built something worth $340 million. I was living on the South Side, retired, watching Ken Burns documentaries. We had an understanding, established years before the success materialized. Calvin tried to repay me many times. I refused every time. Not out of pride, exactly. Because what I had given him was not a loan. It was a bet on a man I believed in, and I had never once needed the world to know I made that bet, or that it paid off in ways I couldn't have imagined. Gerald Whitmore told me Calvin had been his second major investor when the Whitmore Infrastructure Fund was being structured. And Calvin had made it a condition, not a request, a condition that before any final agreements were signed, they find a man named Raymond Ellison in Chicago and make him an offer. Gerald said Calvin had told him there was a man who had financed his entire operation on nothing but friendship and $40,000, who had never once asked for recognition or return or even a mention. Gerald paused. He said Calvin had described me as the most quietly powerful man he had ever known. I said Calvin always did talk too much. Gerald smiled. It was the first time I'd seen him smile, and it fit his face perfectly. Unhurried and genuine, like everything else about him. He said Calvin had also told him that if he ever actually met me, he should pay close attention. That I was the kind of man who communicated more through silence than most people managed in a lifetime of words. I said Calvin was being generous. Gerald said Calvin was being accurate. He told me he had been watching me at the gala. The entire room was laughing, he said, and I was sitting in that chair with more dignity than he had seen any person hold on to in 50 years of professional life. He said he knew that particular expression. He had been in rooms full of formidable people his entire adult life. He recognized the look of a man who has been underestimated so thoroughly, for so long, that he stopped being hurt by it and started finding it almost interesting. He wanted my son to see it. He wanted Marcus to understand that the man he had just called boring already had someone in that room who knew exactly who he was. Then he slid a folder across the table. I want to be honest with you. I want to pause the story right here and just be direct with you, because I think you deserve it. I'm not going to tell you the exact figure on the first page of that folder. What I will tell you is that it had enough zeros to make a 71-year-old man from the south side of Chicago sit very still for a very long time and quietly reconsider everything he had ever told himself about where his life had ended up. Gerald was offering a 15% equity stake in the Whitmore Infrastructure Fund. No capital required from me. My contribution had happened 28 years ago, in a kitchen on the south side, with a legal pad and a handshake. Calvin's investment in the fund traced directly back to the $40,000 I had wired in 1996. Without that first move, Gerald told me, none of what followed was structurally possible. I told him I needed to think about it. He said, of course. I asked him why he had stood up at the gala instead of simply calling me. He had Calvin's name. He had the connection. He didn't need to make a public bid in front of 180 people to arrange a breakfast meeting. He was quiet for a moment. he said, because Marcus had placed me in that chair and handed a room full of people permission to laugh at me. And he had watched me absorb every second of it with more grace than he had seen displayed in 5 decades of business. He looked at me steadily. He said he thought Calvin was right about me. And he had wanted my son to see in that room, in that moment, that the man he was calling boring already had someone present who knew precisely who he was. I called Gerald the next morning and said yes, with one condition. Marcus had been trying to get a meeting with Whitmore Capital for 2 years. I had heard him mention it at Thanksgiving, again at Christmas. Both times I had been pretending not to listen as effectively as I always pretend, which is to say, not very effectively, though he believed otherwise. I didn't want Gerald to take that meeting. Not yet. Perhaps not ever. That was entirely Gerald's business decision to make, but I wanted Marcus to understand why. I wanted him to understand it the way it could only be understood from the inside of a specific room at a specific moment when the architecture finally revealed itself. Gerald was quiet for a long time. Then he said that could be arranged. If you have ever waited for a moment you built to arrive, really waited, the way you wait for something you put in motion years before you knew what it would become. You know what those 6 weeks felt like. I went to the hardware store. I watched my documentaries. I called Calvin and we talked for 2 hours about nothing important and everything that mattered. I was patient, which is something I have had considerable practice being. 6 weeks later, I put on the navy blazer for the 3rd time. Marcus had called me the previous Sunday in his casual Sunday voice, the slightly too relaxed register he deploys when he needs something and doesn't want to appear to be asking for it. He mentioned Whitmore Capital almost in passing, said he'd been trying to get in front of their team for 2 years. Said literally nobody got through, but he'd heard they were taking some meetings and wondered if maybe I knew anyone through my old network. You know, whatever. I said I couldn't think of anyone, pleasantly. There was a pause. Then he said I should come to dinner sometime soon. He stopped before completing the sentence. He knew since when would be the natural next question. He just said soon. I thought, not yet. The 38th floor of the Whitmore Capital building on Michigan Avenue has the kind of view that makes the entire city feel like it was arranged specifically for your perspective. The lake was flat and silver that morning. I arrived at 9, and Gerald's assistant, whose name was Donna, and who had worked for him for 12 years, and had the particular warmth of someone who is quietly exceptional at something most people underestimate, met me at the elevator. She walked me to a side room with coffee. At the door she paused and turned back. She said Mr. Whitmore had told her what the meeting was about. She allowed herself the smallest, professionally controlled smile I have ever witnessed on a human face. She said in 12 years, she had never once seen him prepare for something with this much quiet pleasure. I heard Marcus arrive at 9:30. His voice carried through the wall, his performance register, the warmer and slightly faster version he uses when he needs something from someone important. He told someone the space was extraordinary. He said his team had admired everything Whitmore Capital had built, the infrastructure fund especially. I raised this man. I thought, I built this moment. Maybe those things are not as unrelated as they seem. The meeting began. Gerald's voice through the wall, measured and genuinely curious, asking Marcus about the foundation's structure and goals. Marcus answered with real intelligence and real passion. I felt the complicated love that has followed me through 35 years of fatherhood, the pride that lives directly beside the grief of being misread by the person you are most proud of. Those two things can exist in the same chest at the same time. If you've raised a child, you know exactly what I mean. 20 minutes in, Gerald said he wanted to bring in someone connected to the fund from the beginning. A pause. Of course, Marcus said. I heard the fractional recalibration in his voice. The slight tightening that means, who else is coming, and how does this change what I've been building toward? Donna opened the side room door and nodded at me. I stood, straightened my jacket, picked up the old brown leather briefcase that Diane always said looked tired. I've carried it for 19 years. It has been everywhere with me, and I see absolutely no reason to replace a thing that has done its job without complaint. I walked into the conference room. What happened to Marcus Ellison's face in the 4 seconds that followed is something I intend to carry with me for the rest of my life. First, recognition. That's my father. Then, confusion. Why is my father here? Then, the beginning of arithmetic. Gerald Whitmore knows my father. Things I thought were separate are not separate. And then the fourth expression, the one a performer reaches for when the performance can no longer hold. The stomach-dropping understanding that something has been happening that he didn't know about. That the ground beneath him was not the ground he thought it was. He said, Dad. At about half the volume he intended. I said, Marcus, the way I've said it every Sunday for 35 years. Pleasantly, without drama. I sat across from my son. Gerald sat at the head of the table, and then the conference room door opened one more time, and Calvin Marsh walked in. My oldest friend, 69 years old. He had flown in from Atlanta the previous evening, and we had embraced in the corridor for a long, wordless moment that communicated everything two men need to communicate when they have known each other for 50 years and watched each other become who they were going to be. Calvin sat to Gerald's right and looked at Marcus with the calm, steady gaze of a man who remembered very clearly what it felt like to have nothing and sit across from someone who might change that. I watched Marcus recognize the name. I watched him understand in real time, piece by piece, like someone turning a map right side up after reading it upside down the shape of what he was looking at. Gerald folded his hands on the table. He said, "Marcus, I want to be transparent with you. You deserve to understand the full picture of what this meeting is." Marcus nodded. The performance had completely left his face. What remained was just my son, 36 years old, suddenly looking younger than that. Looking, honestly, like the 9-year-old I'd sat next to at Rush Medical at 2 in the morning. "Your father and I are partners," Gerald said. 15% equity in the Whitmore Infrastructure Fund, finalized 6 weeks ago, established because of a decision your father made 28 years ago. A decision that is foundational to everything this fund is built on. He let it breathe. "I want you to know that your foundation's work is genuine. Your proposal has real substance. Your team has done serious work. Under different circumstances, this would be a different conversation." He paused, with the precision of a man who has chosen his next words over a long time and is finally saying them. "I have been aware of your outreach to Whitmore Capital for 2 years. I made the decision not to take that meeting. I want you to understand why, because I believe you have earned the explanation." Marcus was completely still. His two colleagues, people I had met approximately 60 seconds earlier, had the frozen quality of witnesses who have understood they are watching something private and have no exit. "The night I met your father," Gerald said, "I watched a 71-year-old man be placed on a stage by his own son and made into a punchline in front of a room full of strangers. And I watched him absorb every second of it with more dignity and more grace than I have seen any person carry in 50 years of doing business. His voice did not rise. It never needed to. I don't do business with people who can't recognize the value of what's standing directly in front of them. I don't make exceptions to that principle." The room was so quiet I could hear the city 38 floors below. Calvin was looking at the table. His jaw moved slightly. Marcus's eyes were full. My son, who could perform almost anything, was not performing. He said, "Dad, just that word, stripped of everything." I leaned forward and looked at my son the way I used to when he was small and frightened and needed someone to show him the true shape of things, before he decided he no longer needed that from me. I said, "I need you to hear what I'm about to say, the way I mean it, not the way it might sound." He waited. "I've never needed you to know what I do quietly," I said. "I didn't give Calvin that money for recognition. I didn't spend 28 years declining repayment because I wanted to be discovered. I did those things because that is who I am, patient, content to let the work exist without a spotlight on it." I held his eyes. "But I am 71 years old, and I sat in that chair, and 180 people laughed, and you pointed at me and called me boring in front of strangers who didn't know enough to disagree. And it cost me something, Marcus. I'm not going to pretend it didn't." His jaw tightened, his eyes were full. "So here is what's going to happen." I stood. I buttoned my jacket. "I'm going to go home to the South Side. I'm going to find something at the hardware store that I find genuinely interesting, because I always do, and you are going to sit with this. Not as punishment, as information. About who your father is. About what quiet looks like when it has been paying attention the entire time." I reached across the table and put my hand on my son's shoulder, briefly, firmly, the way fathers do when they love someone completely and are also heartbroken by them and haven't found the words yet that hold both things at once. "Your foundation is good work," I said. "Real work. Keep doing it. But you'll need to find your own investors. That's not cruelty. It's just the correct thing." I picked up my briefcase. I shook Gerald's hand. And I hugged Calvin Marsh the way you hug a man you've known for 50 years in front of whoever happens to be watching, because at 71 years old I embrace my friends and I do not explain myself for doing it. 50 years, Calvin said quietly into my shoulder. 50 years, I said. At the door, Gerald said my name. I turned. He looked at me with the same expression I'd seen once before, at the Ashford house, when he'd turned from watching my son and looked at me across a room full of people who were laughing. Quiet recognition. The kind that has no need to announce itself. "Dinner next week," he said. "Only if there are no prices on the menu," I said. The corner of his mouth moved. Obviously, he said. I walked out. I took the elevator down 38 floors, crossed the lobby, pushed through the glass door onto Michigan Avenue. Chicago received me the way it always has, loudly, generously, entirely indifferent to the private seismic events of any individual life. I stood on the sidewalk for a moment and let the city move over me. October air off the lake, cold and clean and specific to this place in a way I have never been able to fully explain to anyone who didn't grow up with it. The traffic, the people, the whole enormous ongoing project of a city that never once considered slowing down for anyone's personal reckoning. Inside my jacket was a document my accountant Harold, a careful and deeply conservative man who had never in 25 years of managing my modest finances said anything resembling excitable had described as the kind of thing that changes the shape of a life. Marcus would rebuild. I know my son. He is stubborn and he is talented, and underneath the gala and the microphone and the joke about the hardware store, he is still the boy I raised. The boy I drove to practice in the rain. The boy I sat next to at 2 a.m. when I was more frightened than I knew how to admit. He would sit with what happened in that conference room. He would turn it over. He would eventually, not soon, but eventually understand it the way it needed to be understood. And when he was ready, I would be on the south side, where I have always been, patient, present, paying attention. I took the red line home, made coffee, sat at my kitchen table, and for the first time since a Saturday night in the Gold Coast when my own son offered me to a room full of strangers for $1, Raymond Ellison felt exactly and completely like himself. Not boring. He was never boring. He was just quiet. And the thing about quiet men, the thing Marcus Ellison was only beginning to understand, 38 floors up on Michigan Avenue with Calvin Marsh's eyes on the table and Gerald Whitmore's words still in the room, is that quiet is not the same as absent. Quiet men see everything. Quiet men remember everything. And quiet men, when they finally decide the moment has arrived, when they button their jacket and pick up the old briefcase and walk out of a room they have just completely rearranged, do not look back. They have never needed to. Now let me ask you something directly before I go. Drop a 1 inch the comments if you think Raymond did the right thing walking out without intervening on his son's behalf with Gerald. Drop a 2 if you think he should have gone further, said more, taken more. Drop a 3 if you've been in a room where someone made you the joke and you had to decide in real time what to do with your face. I want to know. I genuinely want to know. And tell me where you're watching from and what time it is there, because this community is everywhere, and that still stops me every time I think about it. If this story found you, it found you for a reason. And if you've ever been the quiet person in a loud room, the one people talked over or pointed at or underestimated so many times you started to wonder if maybe they were right, I want you to know that this story was for you specifically. Hit the like button if it stayed with you. Subscribe if you haven't. I'm here every week with stories that are real, that are complicated, and that don't insult your intelligence. Thank you for being here. This is a fictional story inspired by real emotional experiences. Fully rewritten and reimagined in Chicago, Illinois, to create original content. Any resemblance to real people or events is coincidental.